Disclaimer, I'm a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Here.
What about now?
Oh, yes, I can. Hello there.
Okay. I was
yeah,
hoping
hey.
to do it through the headphones to avoid any background noise, but clearly that didn't work.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. So I cannot, because of the way that like streaming works on here. You might not be able to see me, but like on my stream, and you can look at my stream to verify this. I don't want to like, you don't have to just take my word for it. We can like the people can see the both of us, right? It's just because like my video recorder, I don't know how to get it. I need to work. This is something I need to work on, but like I cannot get it to go to two sources, both Discord and my streaming service.
I'm not tech savvy. I trust you.
All right, thank you. But yeah, hey, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to having this sort of a discussion for a while. Because do you mind if I sort of like explain sort of like why I invited you on and everything?
By all means.
Awesome. So obviously there's been a long-standing conversation that's been happening in the trans community. A lot of it had very unhealthily, I think that a lot of us could pretty easily say, but a conversation nonetheless about dysphoria, right? And a conversation about like what it means to be transgender and what it means to be, like how someone comes to know that they are trans, right? Now, for me, I approach this from the perspective of, I'm a binary trans woman. I have experienced dysphoria. And so in this sense, I probably have more in common with some people who identify or who have been labeled as trans medicalists, at least as far as my lived experience goes, right? But that being said, I also want to recognize that like obviously I've argued against trans medicalism, and I'm thinking a lot about this, and I'll release a video sometime, and hopefully this conversation will help inform that video on like the nature of dysphoria. But fundamentally I want to I'm trying to approach the subject from the perspective of I know what it's like for people to judge my lived experience, for people to judge my identity based on the fact that they cannot associate with it and they cannot understand it, and by virtue of the fact that they cannot understand it, then usually they will use that as the rationale for dismissing it, right? Most people are not trans, so they're like, what? You were born a guy and now you're a woman? That's crazy. I can't relate to that. You must be insane, right? And so I understand what it's like to be in that sort of position, and so I don't want to, take away from the lived experience of other people who come from different backgrounds from my own. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to get out of this, right? Like, I do not understand the idea of being trans and not feeling dysphoria. So I'm hoping to be able to just talk about some questions of mine, talk about your lived experience, and honestly just like help me understand a bit better, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah. By all means. It's part of the reason I'm very open to talking about this is because I know that for a lot of people, both in and out of the trans community, the concept of being trans without having dysphoria does not scan and doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's part of the reason that I'm very open to having these conversations, because I would like to try and help, if I can, get people to understand the angle at which I come at my life and my own trans experience. And I mean, part of that is honestly just the language that I use. I'm very careful with my words. I don't claim to be a trans woman.
Okay.
I never have, but I do consider myself to be trans because given that I am, given the way that I look, that I present, that I live, my sense of self, and the fact that at this point I have been on testosterone blockers for 3.5 years and on estrogen for 6 months soon. I don't understand by what measure I could possibly be considered cis.
Sure. No, I definitely get that. So maybe that's the best question to start off with, and this will also help me, so I just can be respectful and know how to refer to you. So like, what would you describe your identity to be, and also like, what pronouns would you prefer that I use when talking to you throughout this conversation?
Well, I identify as gender fluid, which is a term I love because it is both just inherently descriptive. My sense of gender wanders. I was born male. Now, at this point, and we may or may not get into this as we go along, but like my sort of standard sense of self, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, has been over the years, and I do mean years, I mean like decades, because I'm pushing 40, has been drifting more feminine as time has gone on, but I still have a sense of my own masculinity, which is not something that I run away from. And there are days where that is much more where I'm at. It's the case less frequently, but so like on the spectrum of gender, if you have male and female, and and it is a spectrum, so you've got your far ends, you've got all the non-binary options. Gender fluid, it means that it's more like a scatter plot. I any given day I could be any number of places on that spectrum, depending on my own sense of self and where I'm feeling with things. As far as pronouns go, it's largely situational for me. So what I say at this point is I honestly just tell people whatever pronoun is the one that makes sense in your head, go with that. I'm not going to be offended. I've been around long enough that I can tell when someone is trying to use pronouns to be a jerk at me with. So as long as you're not doing that, whatever. You know what I need? I need a pin that says pronouns indifferent.
Interesting. No, I mean, like that makes some degree of sense. So as we're going through this, just so I can think standardly, do you mind if I just go with she, her then?
Go for it.
Okay, awesome. So, okay, that's very interesting. So I guess that the first question then, because like from my lived experience, as I explained a little bit earlier, like the way that I sort of knew that I was trans, right? If we're just talking trans generally, not just binary, or a binary trans woman, was because of dysphoria, right? Was because I felt a discomfort with my body and with how I was seen in society and treated in society. And based on that, and based on the fact that it didn't go away through mitigating it from other factors, like trying to, I don't know, improve my quality of life as a man, and, for lack of better terms, right? Eventually I came to realize that like this discomfort that I felt, was like could be only resolved or could be best resolved by me coming out as trans and transitioning to live as a woman. So how would you describe the experience of you figuring out that you were trans, and how would you describe the feelings that you felt as you were sort of figuring that out?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I'm honestly still figuring it out. And that's part of my own personal experience as someone who doesn't have...
Sorry.
This is my partner behind me. We love you, babe.
Hi there.
But as someone who doesn't have dysphoria, and I do not... What I'm about to say, I do not mean this in any way to imply that dysphoria is in any way a good thing. I'm incredibly grateful for the fact that I do not have severe dysphoria. But one thing that dysphoria does do, at least from the perspective that I've gotten talking to people who have it, is that it does give you a clearer direction, because you feel this sense of where you started, your assigned birth, your gender that was assigned at birth, and you are pushing away from it. And just the momentum of that is going to propel you on your own trans journey. So someone without dysphoria, I don't have a lot of momentum. So, when I say I'm 38 now, and I have been questioning my sense of gender since I was 11. And I think for most people questioning it that early, they would have come to a much firmer sense of where they were going to end up well before where I am now. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the outcomes of my not having dysphoria is that my own journey as a trans person has been way more meandering.
Sure.
And much more, it's been the scenic route, because I didn't have a strong push away from my masculinity to sort of point me in a clearer direction. It has been a decades-long experience of feeling some kind of pull towards femininity and experimenting a little bit, and then maybe being good with that, and then some years later taking it in a new direction and trying other things. So, I first started cross-dressing when I was 11.
Okay. I
started going out in public in dress, but as a drag queen, as a performer, when I was 23. I came across and for a long time I considered myself to be a cis crossdresser.
Mm-hmm.
As I got a better sense of myself and that this ran deeper than just occasional aesthetic preference, I adopted gender fluid around 33, 34. I started hormones at 36. This has been incredibly gradual for me. And I think part of the reason it's been as slow as it is because I don't have dysphoria, giving me that push to be like, oh, well, I know it's not that. So I need to get away from, if I had dysphoria about having been born male and the things that came with that, I would have had this. I need to get away from that. Wherever I land, whether it's non-binary or as a woman or whatever, I need to get away from that because that feels wrong. And I didn't have that. So instead, it's just this slow progression as I figure out, well, does this suit me a little bit better?
Mm-hmm.
And I like for myself, for the kind of person that I am and the kind of outlook that I have, this sort of longer, more scenic route actually kind of suits me and it works for me. Okay. I'm not sure it would work for everybody, but that's sort of how I've ended up where I am. And like I said, I am still figuring it out to a certain degree. I'm still, I don't know where I'm going to end up. I don't identify as a trans woman.
Yeah.
I'm more open to the possibility that I may eventually at some point down the line, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I still don't know.
Yeah. No, I definitely hear you. And there is, I think, a degree of comfort in just being able to take your time and, sort of figure yourself out, at your own pace, right? Like, I definitely understand that. I suppose that, because I think that you've touched on this a little bit. I've watched some of your videos where you talk about this, right? And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just trying to make sure that I generally understand where you're coming from. It sounds like what you're saying, that instead of feeling some sort of discomfort with how you were assigned at birth and how you've been treated in society, that it's more of just feeling a preference for a different gender role as you sort of experiment and figure out what you like. Would that be an accurate way to sort of describe your experience?
Yeah. In broad terms, that is kind of it, because I haven't had to dive as hard into trans options because I didn't have dysphoria making my masculine life a living hell.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just gone for this much more slow experimental form of trans that I now live.
Yeah, no, and I definitely hear that. Now, I will say, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your video, but if you could expound on this, because this is sort of where I get a little tripped up, right? Like, for me, if I'm just thinking through this, if I'm trying to imagine myself in your shoes, I could in some way see a lot of parallels between your and my own experience, and indeed the experience of a lot of trans people who I know and who I have, who I've talked to about this, right? Insofar as to say that, like, a lot of trans people, like, I'll talk about my own lived experience, for the first 21 years of my life, I presented as a man, right? And it wasn't necessarily that I hated my experience, but that I knew that I would have preferred to have lived life and to have experienced life as a woman, right? And for people to treat me as such, right? And so it wasn't so much that I was in like debilitating pain for the longest time, but more that I was just like very apathetic to my own existence, that life was more shades of gray instead of seeing colors, right? And now that I'm at a much better point in my life, I do see the world in all colors and I'm living it to the fullest and I'm really enjoying myself. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on the idea on this question that I think a lot of other, especially like, people who are much more critical of you will put it in a very sort of bad faith sort of way, right? We'll frame it in a very bad faith sort of way. But I was wondering if you might comment on the idea that, like, do you think it's possible that, like, people, that you and other people with dysphoria are talking about the same thing, but are just coming up with different ways to phrase it or different ways to present it?
Possibly. I mean, something that I try very hard to do, and I don't always do it as well as I would like, but something that I try very hard to do in all my videos is to define the terms as I am using them.
Okay.
Because it is a pretty common issue, like talking about anything really, is that you use a word but the way that you use it and mean it is not the same way as the people who you're talking to use it and mean it. And that I've actually had that come up even within the realm of dysphoria, because, you know, I when I say that I don't have dysphoria, that's not strictly true, but what I experience and the degree of it is so minor that for me it feels somehow wrong to label it the same way that, you know, people who I know and I love and who matter to me use that same word to describe something that was a true blight, or is still a true blight on their life and their ability to live a full life. And for me, it's at best, or at worst, I suppose, a minor annoyance. But that's still the only kind of word for it. So I think there is a distinct possibility that at the heart of the issue with people who take issue with me and my life and how I choose to describe myself, that it may ultimately be more of an issue of communication than anything else. Because not to name names, but, you know, when I had someone call me out in a video for calling myself trans, the way that they presented it was as if I said I was a trans woman, which I didn't. And they took the word trans to only mean binary trans, which is obviously not what I am.
Yeah.
So there is a barrier in terms of we're all using the same words, but we have not actually agreed on what all those words mean. And if we could have language that we all agreed on what these things mean, then maybe some of these issues wouldn't even exist anymore, because at least the start of the arguments often feel like it's a breakdown of arguing about definitions.
Yeah. No, and I definitely hear that. And I guess this is actually going into sort of like my dilemma in this situation, because I tend to stick to academic and more medicalized terminology, even though I understand that runs a bit of a risk, because like people like trans medicalism is the scary boogeyman term, you know, where a lot of people will try to use a medicalized framework to try and advance their own otherwise bigoted beliefs, right? Even though the vast majority of like academic and medical consensus is that, so for example, we take the term transgender. At its most basic, the academic consensus is that it's just to identify as something different from your assigned gender at birth. That's it, right? Like very basic, it's an umbrella term, right? And people will disagree with that, but that's generally what the academic consensus is. So usually I just stick to that, because there is a lot of infighting and there's a lot of disagreement when we're talking about non-binary or gender fluid people. Again, like vast majority scientific consensus, that's valid. Ooh, you know, you're great. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use that sort of term, but you know, that like, it's interesting to me when people who identify as more trans medicalists or who are trans medicalists as labeled by the community try to make arguments which do largely go against like the medical consensus. But I suppose that my question to you, because this is the dilemma for me, is that according to, I believe it's a DSM-6, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the last time I looked at it, it said that gender dysphoria is an indicator of being trans, but is not necessary, right? So that is sort of where, and that's, you know, the top authority on the subject matter at this time. But I still have a problem perceiving of that, right? This has certainly helped me, but I suppose what I'm wondering is if you see, like, let's take a hypothetical, for example. Let's say that you have a trans woman, all right, a binary trans woman, and who says that she has dysphoria, but otherwise has the exact same experience that you do, all right, like essentially just didn't really care about whether or not she was a man, but felt felt some kind of benefit from living as a woman and being treated as a woman, or at least being treated not as a man, right? Then, and let's say that they would describe that as dysphoria. Well, then how do you sort of resolve that distinction, right? That you and her have very different definitions. Like you literally have a disagreement about what is dysphoria among the two of you with the same sort of experience. Like, how do you resolve that?
The problem is I don't know how to answer that as a hypothetical, because the only way that could be resolved would be an actual one-on-one conversation with the person.
Sure.
Which is, again, part of the problem of trying to address a lot of these things through forums like YouTube. And while I do think YouTube can be a powerful tool and other things like it, ultimately you're trying to have conversations with however many people you can get to watch your video. So, thousands, millions if you're lucky.
Yeah.
But that means that anything you say is being applied broadly.
Sure.
Whereas something like that, I would actually be very interested to have that conversation with somebody like that. But until I do, I don't know where the distinctions would be. Or if there would be one, and if it would just come down to a difference of definition, and that someone could otherwise, just looking at our experience and sense of self, put us in more or less the same place. How would I reconcile that? I don't know, because I haven't got to have that conversation, because it's the kind of conversation I would need to have with the person, if that makes sense.
No, and I mean, I get that. I won't push this too far, because again, like, this is more just me learning about your perspective than trying to resolve these issues necessarily. So I won't necessarily take that too much farther. I suppose that, well, do you mind if you talk just a little bit? Because one thing that did make me aware of you, right, was the fact that you were addressed by a lot of larger creators, in not the greatest kind of way. Would you care to talk about your experience, like, just personally from dealing with all that? Because I'm not sure if I've seen like a lot of other trans creators sort of talk to you about this since.
In anything close to a public forum, they haven't really. Like, I've had private conversations with people, including other trans YouTubers.
Yeah.
But so I've basically had this come up twice.
Okay.
Although the circumstances were slightly different. So I run multiple YouTube channels. I have a channel for Vera Wylde, and I also have Council of Geeks. I also have that has a sub channel called Break Room of Geeks, but that's a side project at this point. So and the size disparity in subscribers is actually fairly big. Right now, Vera Wylde has about 12,000 subscribers. Council of Geeks has 44,000. But so a couple of years ago, a video was made. I made a video in response to Scarlett Johansson being cast to play a trans man.
Okay.
Which was something that really ticked me off.
Sure.
and I made a video about that, and then a YouTuber with about 20 times the subscriber base I had, he made a video compiling different trans responses to that, all of them negative, towards that idea, and him basically cherry picking little pieces and mocking us.
Yeah.
So I wasn't even the only one called out in that. That resulted in about a month of abusive comments directed at me, directed at other people in my comments section, from his subscribers, who basically descended onto my channel and actively harassed me for about a month.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Earlier this year, I had a video that was up on Vera Wylde get highlighted by a very sizable trans YouTuber who, well, first of all, put my face in the thumbnail. Lovely. And it was a video not only talking about my video, talking about being trans without dysphoria, but also highlighting that a person who claimed to be trans without dysphoria, sending her threats of physical violence. And she addressed both of them in the same video and did a very poor job of making it clear that the person who threatened her was not me, and that was somebody else. So despite the fact that I actually take way more issues with that more recent instance, I actually had a lot fewer problems as a result of that. And that in that case, it was somebody with 75 times the subscriber base that the Vera Wylde channel had. And
wow,
this may be very, very cynical, but I can be a cynical person by nature.
Okay.
I strongly suspect the reason I got way less harassment in the latter case was because she did not link to my video in the description. which meant people had to do not a lot of work, but a little work in order to find me.
Sure.
Whereas the guy from 2 years ago, he put a link to my video right in his description, which meant his subscribers were one click away from having me in their sites and being able to come at me. But that said, there was definitely, on the specific video that she highlighted, there was a flood of negative comments. There was a flood of thumbs down votes, all of which actually helped the video. I don't know if these people realize that that's all considered engagement.
Right. Yeah, the YouTube algorithm appreciates any engagement and all that. And
yeah.
It'd be very interesting. Did you grow from that? Like, did you get a lot of growth after that? Wow.
Yeah, the Vera Wylde channel had the biggest subscriber bump I'd had in a year off the back of that.
Oh my god, that's crazy. I mean, like, hey, you know, like, good. Like, it's terrible that you had to deal with the harassment, but you know, at least there was something good to come out of it, right?
Yeah. So, and with that second video, with that second instance, it was different, but it was also very familiar. Because in the first instance, I was being descended on by the fans of a male skeptic YouTuber, and I can't prove this because everyone's anonymous, but the sense of most of what I got was that I was being harassed primarily by men who just had no interest in who I was, how I think, how I present. They just didn't care.
Right.
With what happened this year, I was being come at from people who one would think would have a better chance at connecting with and understanding me. And I say that's familiar because going back even into, 10, 15 years ago, when I was either performing in drag or just consider myself to be a cisgender crossdresser.
Sure.
And this is not me saying I was perfect and like was always doing, the best sort of things with my life, but the harshest pushback and that I've gotten very consistently since I've been into any degree of public has been from within the trans community. And so it's people who share some similarities with me, but in other ways do not. And I don't know if that's part of the reason why it gets so harsh, because like I'm not the same as them, but I'm close enough that it feels personal to them for some reason. So in some ways what happened this year, while the scale of it was much less, and I'm certainly appreciative of that, it dredged up a lot more past stuff than the one from a few years ago.
I'm sorry. That is terrible. I suppose if one thing that I do want to comment on here, right, is because like this is an important discussion I think to have in the trans community. I do, right? Like this is something I see people, and this is being completely candid, right? Because I'm in the weird spot, right? As I mentioned before, where I have a lot more lived experience in common with probably some of the people that you have referenced, right? Like I live full-time as a woman. I'm fully transitioned, like literally all medical transitioned. I have my degree behind me. I literally even got that changed so that has my, my chosen name on it, right? Like I have a lot more in common with the people who probably, did these things to you as far as my lived experience is concerned. The problem is that like what they did to you is absolutely morally admonishable, right? I'm sorry that you had to deal with that, and I'm sorry that that's the way that this conversation has had to go, because it is an important one, but it's hard to have because there's really so much blood in the floor now. Obviously,
go ahead.
Yeah.
There's a lot of anger, and I want to be fair. I do understand where a lot of it comes from. Because like I can look back at my own history. I can think back to about 10 years ago when I was living in New York City. I can remember, and this, like, I was still only identifying as a crossdresser then. I can remember seeing someone who I have no idea what their identity was, but someone who, had makeup and heels and a dress and visible stubble. And it ticked me off. I didn't say anything to this person. I didn't do anything, but on a gut level, it ticked me off because part of my brain went, oh my God, is that how other people see me?
Yeah.
Which, I had no business thinking that, but that's still a visceral gut level. And so I know that trans people who have dysphoria, and especially a lot of trans advocates who have used dysphoria as a big part of the push for their legitimacy, a lot of emphasis has been put on that. So for some of them, to see someone like me who has, I'm on hormones. When I have breasts. I'm clearly not cis, but I'm also not what they are. I know that some of them deep down worry that cisgender people will look at me and go, oh, well, you're like that.
Right.
And I'm not. I'm something else, but I know that there is fear and anger around the idea that I become a point of reference for someone else's experience where it doesn't match. And I think it's also part of the reason that there's oftentimes a lot of tension between the trans community and the drag community.
Right.
Because for a long time, drag queens were the closest thing to a point of reference, the cis and heteronormative population had to being transgender. And so trans people had to continuously keep pointing at that and go, no, not that. And I know to some extent for some trans people, especially ones with dysphoria, I kind of fall under a category of them having to point at me and go, no, not that. That's not my experience.
Right.
And in some cases, I know that having to do that and having to explain yourself, not only what you are, but what you aren't, and having to do that continually gets frustrating, and it can make you angry, and I would say even justifiably. But I think it's important that if you have anger, that it gets directed in the right place, which is if anyone is the issue, it's someone who is equating me with a binary trans woman. Because I'm not doing that. But if someone else is trying to do that and you feel that it's muddying, I say you, I don't mean you personally, but
you're all good.
And you feel it's muddying your experience as a binary trans woman, I'm not trying to do that. Somebody else from the outside is looking in and is trying to mesh us together and muddy the waters. I'm just trying to be.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. Someone actually just asked a question, and this might be a very quick answer, but it might be worth resolving since you don't experience dysphoria in the same way, and you're saying that you're something different from like a binary trans person. Would you say that being trans, or at least that that your identity was something that you chose to do as opposed to something that's like an intrinsic quality of who you are?
That's a difficult one for me to answer because for me, I identify a lot with the journey that I've been on. I've said in the past that I don't think what I am now, like in many ways, but speaking specifically to my trans experience, I don't think I could be living right now 10 years ago. I don't think as a human being, I was in a position to be able to do this comfortably. So for me, looking back on my life, I do think that there is something inherent in me.
Sure.
I don't think my fluctuating sense of gender is a choice. Like I said, I've been experimenting with cross-dressing since I was 11. I don't think that whatever it is about me that sparked that direction, I think that's inherent, and that's pretty much always been there.
Sure.
Because I don't have dysphoria, I think I have more leeway in terms of being able to choose how I navigate that. Because dysphoria would would again sort of just eliminating things like, well, this doesn't work and this doesn't work, cuts a clearer path. And so I think I have, for lack of a better way to put it, more freedom of choice in how I live my transness. But I do think that I don't think I've chosen to be trans. I think my lack of dysphoria gives me much more freedom to comfortably find a way to express it.
That makes sense. So if I might, because I think that we've had a good discussion, I just want to try and, I suppose, summarize the understanding that you're conveying to me. My understanding right now is that instead of feeling dysphoria, and dysphoria being defined as some discomfort either with the way that people treat you or with your own body, you feel, I suppose, if for lack of a better term, a euphoria from experimenting with different gender roles and just going with what feels the best at the time. Would that be a good way to sort of describe your lived experience?
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's very interesting to think of being trans or a trans experience from the perspective of doing something which brings you happiness as opposed to trying to do something to alleviate pain. This is something which has been talked about a lot in the trans community for a good while, right? Like the idea of trying to disassociate, or like the health, the mental health and well-being of people, like inherently associating trans identity with something inherently painful, right? And I don't love that, right? Like I do think that there's a lot of credibility to the idea that a trans experience can be very joyful, very happy. And, you know, nowadays, like I can resonate with that a lot, and that like I feel a lot of joy from my lived experience. And for lack of a better term, right? Like I understand I don't want to, because, you know, like in the bipolar community, or like, you know, with bipolar disorders or so on, like people, like euphoria as a term takes on a much more medicalized definition. So we're just using the euphoria as a stand-in for lack of a better term. But I think it is in some ways healthy to think of trans identity in a much more positive light. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
And that's the direction I would really like to see things go, because to frame it primarily, and definitely if you try and do it exclusively through the lens of dysphoria, is to frame it as pain. And like, I don't want to diminish anyone's pain in their life that has been associated with being trans, whether it's coming out or the processes that you had to go to, or how people have treated you. But I would like to think that the goal, like at some point down the line, would be to create a situation where people have the freedom to experiment, figure out for themselves, and it does not require suffering to either figure yourself out or to get help. I think I'm very fortunate that, and I think it helped that with my doctor when we started talking about hormones, that, you know, I've been like, I had decades worth of lived experience to basically talk through with him, so that he knew this wasn't something that I was just doing on a whim. And, you know, we had those conversations. But if I hadn't had that, and it came across to him as more of a spur of the moment notion, I would have been referred to all these specialists, probably psychologists and all these other things, trying to diagnose me as if I have a problem.
Yeah.
Instead of just being a person whose sense of self doesn't line up with what's on my birth certificate.
Yeah. I mean,
why does that have to mean pain? And I understand for many people it has meant pain.
Sure.
And I would never try and diminish that. But to say that, like, that's what it is, that I would think, even if you're going to make that argument for now, that I would hope you would at least say, but hopefully someday we can make it so that's not what the trans experience is, even if you believe that's what it is now.
Yeah. No, and I definitely get that. I will say that, like, I don't want to, like, I agree with you. I don't want to take away from the lived experience of people who have felt like serious dysphoria and serious pain, right? I'm sort of talking romantically to someone right now who does have some of that in their lived experience. And I've been with other people, and I've had many friends, and I've been with many people who have had that sort of a lived experience, right, where there's been a lot of pain in, you know, their history from gender dysphoria, right? Like, and I get that. This has been a better conversation for me because in a lot of ways, I do have an experience which is a lot more similar to you in that, like, I mean, hell, there was once upon a time, for people who are watching who are unfamiliar with me, I mean, like, hell, I was like a hometown hero sort of character. Like, I was captain of like the track and football team, and like I was very, you know, I was serving up guy, right? It's not like a lot of trans people go through a phase where, you know, maybe they're presenting, especially like for trans women, we're presenting like very femme from a young age, and that just wasn't my experience, right? Because it wasn't so much that I felt an overwhelming pain, but rather that I was just very apathetic to my own lived experience, and that I knew that I would prefer the alternative, at least in a binary sense. So yeah, that gives me a lot of vocabulary to work with. I really appreciate that.
I was honored that you asked me to be on.
Yeah, no problem. Is there anything else that you want to say? Do you want to shout yourself out? I mean, like, you have a bigger channel than I do. Thank you again for. let me say thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it because you are the larger creator than I am, and I appreciate, you know, taking time to coming on here and talking with me.
Oh, I was very happy to do it. Yeah, if people don't know my stuff, you can look up either Vera Wylde or Council of Geeks. You'll find a decent amount of stuff under both of them. Council of Geeks gets updated more regularly as a YouTube channel, and also the Twitter gets updated more regularly. But if you're interested in anything like that, if you're interested primarily in my trans experience and my videos about that, you would want to go to Vera Wylde for that. And Wylde is spelled Wylde because I had to spell it in the most pretentious way I could possibly think.
Hey, listen. I'm sorry. I smiled, and yeah, in response, yeah, I totally, yeah, you're fine. All right, well, hey, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I won't take up any more of your time. And yeah, if you ever want to talk again, like, let me know. You can obviously find me on Twitter, and you know where my YouTube is now. And hey, you're in my Discord, so if you ever want to chat through there, then also very easy. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
All right, bye.